We'll open first to the room for questions,
yep, okay.
And it'll take a minute for the online feed to catch up. So first.
I'm very intrigued by this notion of trust. I've been around in this planet for over 17 years, and the notion of trust intrigues me. And one reason I did this way is that you don't have to bother with trust. What you do is you sit the evidence. And, chronology with evidence, you pile up the evidence and you run with whatever you've got. And if someone else comes up with a different piece of evidence, then you build that to equation. And one of the things I really love is David Hume, because he's writing this article on miracles. He says, how can you trust a miracle? And he says, well, how many reliable witnesses have you got? And he finds out there aren't many. And then he says, if at the end of the day that you can't get the witnesses, what do you do? You take the opposite and you ask yourself the probability of which is more likely or not. So in other words, I don't trust.
Yeah. And trust is a big theme, obviously, in social sciences and law and humanities. So we can't just dismiss it and say, I don't trust, and therefore let's not study it.
But lots of people go with trust.
Yeah, but what constitutes trust? And then how do you trust? Which evidence? What do you raise? Which evidence do you trust? And what sources of evidence do you trust? And in any case, the nature of miracles, for example, is there something else that's more interesting than the fact of whether a miracle is somehow verifiable by conventional scientific means? There might be something else. It's a bit like saying, never mind miracles, what I've said about the singularity and other sort of some of these slightly wacky concepts. They have a value and they circulate, and it's the phenomenon of their circulation and the value people attach to them, which I, as someone in the humanities, find really interesting. So it's a cultural phenomenon. I think with loads of issues, we can actually just examine the phenomenon in its own right. Why do people trust this? Not is it true in some absolute sense, and if it isn't, then dismiss it. No, it's why do people actually attach value to this thing that we're looking at.
Right, so it's not interesting. I'm really struck by, I'm not sure that your ability to address this, but if sci-art or science humanities interface, which really sits within the digital space more than other space. But I am struck by that line about validating and the exclamation mark, using science to validate extremes-based good for you. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those relationships between the humanities and the phenomenological and hermeneutic approach, and then the science coming in sometimes to validate that in some way through the digital connections or digital attachments or digital data.
Well, you know the pragmatic of putting together a grant proposal these days, and that's one work package for this current project, which has serious funding. The one this is with older people now, it's called Aging and Mobility. And this is one work package, and it helped us get the grant. So the fact we've done this study, and it does add another dimension to a study that's also epidemiological, that's being done by some human geographers, another aspect which is design oriented. And the challenge now is at the end of the 3 years to bring these things together. But I think evidence is a good term to use in this context, and the idea of triangulation in a way, which is an old social science research methods idea. We're having a go from these different angles, different sides. I mean, the EEG study is great for me because I haven't done anything that's vaguely empirical for years, and this is a good test case for me to, in other contexts, perhaps not the papers put out of this particular study, but for me to reflect philosophically on what sort of, what's happening. Why are we putting trust in something that's kind of a bit wacky, but happens to involve high-tech equipment?
Yeah.
My colleagues in landscape, who are in a way the senior PI and the co-PI, but she's very committed to the idea of changing policy, and she says almost cynically that the only way you're going to get governments to change policy is to demonstrate them need more open space with park planning or need to design it better. It's to show them some stats and figures. So from a hermeneutical perspective, it's incredibly pragmatic. It's we could resist and we could say we have nothing to do with that, or we could actually enter into that game and see how far.
So could you just expand on that a little bit by maybe explaining what humanities is bringing to that. What is humanities bringing to
that particular experiment?
That would not be served simply by the scientific approach or method.
No, I think, let's see. Okay, in the case of that particular work package, which involves the EEG, and all the people working, walking intersection over several days, there's also an ethnographic component. So there's somebody observing, watching, interviewing, and talking. So the personal stories aspect would be an approach to that. But the paper that's just gone in for review has none of that in it. It's just simply reporting the data. So it's EPSRC, and that's the EPSRC aspect of it. It's not.
And it is EPSRC funded?
It's actually combined funding council. So it's actually HRC.
Yeah, I mean, this is another broader context, really, but I suppose I'm concerned that the AHRC, which is the Arts Humanities Research Council, seeks collaborations with non-arts and humanities, yet in the end, they speak to things that drive the production of knowledge as being valid in this humanity.
But it's fair to say that, because this was, I don't know if you remember it, when it was 3 or 4 years ago, the call, Aging Mobility.
Yeah,
and there's about 10 projects. And ours is the only one that has that kind of techie aspect to it.
Okay.
And my colleague in Sheffield, and she's a bit sniffy about the EEG stuff, which puts people up. So don't worry about the AHRC.
And I guess my question is kind of a PhD researcher point of view. What was your advice talking about notes and research that you have access to, and then talking about what sources we can trust? And should be drawing on what would your advice be to PhD researchers on how to navigate and negotiate just the seemingly infinite amount of information that we have access to with quite relatively small projects?
I think it's easier than we think. But all because we have journals online, and we trust them according to whatever criteria we normally apply to journals, so nothing particularly has changed there. So that is an internet resource, especially for academics, although increasingly for everybody, with open access and what have you. So that, to me, is the authoritative source for papers, and even just Google Scholar, and I'm constantly searching things, Google Scholar, and a paper pops up or whatever. One can be quite capricious about that, and maybe that's something one wants to be careful of. But then you've got other sources, and our colleague here, she's still here, is looking at the internet as a repository of cultural means, if you like. So you can search around on singularity outside of mathematics. What does that mean? And sure enough, outside of mathematics, what comes to the top of Google, there's all sorts of conjectures about a future where machines are as intelligent or more so than us. And so that's a fascinating cultural resource. So you can scrutinize that, study it, tag it, look at it. In the same way that social scientists and Marxist theorists 30 years ago used to trawl through Clio magazine or whatever and look at advertising and popular representations of the body or whatever. We've got those sources there online. There's a lot of them, probably too much, but then we have to develop methods of sampling.
I guess that's one of the questions to do with understand what might be coming. What would your advice be on?
Yeah, well, and whoever else told it to me. I think so. All right. Okay, well, I'll put words into your mouth. Because we were having a conversation about it earlier, and what I would say to students, I'll encourage them to do this sort of thing, is time limited. So you say that I'm looking at, one of our MSc students was looking at the downing of the Malaysian aircraft, and that was a big deal in China because a lot of Chinese people on board. And then some bit of aircraft washed up onto the beach in Madagascar and whatever. And so there was a big flurry of interest on Twitter using the hashtag MA whatever and some number, which is a well-known hashtag which identifies tweets to do with that whole incident. And she was looking at over a time period of a year or whatever, every 12th tweet on that topic, and then analysing it in various ways, see what proportion are sort of expressing sympathies and prayers for the deceased or the families, which are sort of, when people make up stories. Anyway, different categories, so you can categorise that stuff. So that's one method of looking at what's happening through these media.
Question
oh, okay.
board, and the question is this, and I'm going to try to just read it. Do structures of dissemination pose a danger of becoming ensconced in one's existing values and not being exposed to challenges to one's views? In the virtual sphere, it's not hard to find sources with which one instinctively agrees and to avoid exposure to anything likely to rock the boat. And this is your point maybe about how efficient conservatism is, right? Could the recent surge in lobbying for safe spaces actually be a product of this myopia as people become less accustomed to confronting that which perturbs their beliefs?
Yeah, I mean, that is a serious, and just think of one's own practice, particularly in the political sphere. I mean, without disclosing anything, during the Scottish independence referendum, I defriended people whose views were contrary to my own. Surely that's, and friends being people who you'd see their newsfeed and a constant barrage of stuff, and then it became campaigning. And I think we do, particularly on political issues, but other issues as well, we tend to be selective, in that case through a gesture on my part of deliberately unfriending somebody or something. But yeah, we search around, don't we? And if there's some minor medical ailment or a serious medical ailment or some condition which you can talk about, you can think of what you'll talk about. Hearing in one ear is sort of diminishing to something like that, look it up. But you keep looking until you find something that confirms that it's not that serious. Or if you're more of a hypochondriac, something that says, well, really, this is deadly serious, you've got a brain aneurysm right to appear. So yeah, we do hunt around, don't we? I don't know if that helps this person. But what was he saying? A solution? Open, clear spaces?
No, the safe spaces are actually possibly a product of this, product of the ways in which I think that our own consumption of media and of knowledge and of information can be so precisely driven by our own ex-tant beliefs.
And this is happening with, I guess, with extremism, isn't it? That's one of the arguments about extremism. So somebody selectively, once they're hooked onto by ISIS or whoever, they can then they pray, and then they just rule out all this other stuff. And it's heavy-duty indoctrination, and we can willingly subject ourselves to this, whatever it is. And that's an extreme case, but it could be just something more benign, just opinions about something or other. So yeah, I tend to think there's an amplification of the problems, but in a way the problem is it's not a new problem, because we always had this issue. I guess the hermeneutical project, the idea of interpretation theory as proposed by Derrida and building on Heidegger and loads of other people, is that prejudice has always been there, and also we need prejudice, we need a position, so we need a kind of an indoctrination, we need a belief that is our starting point. So before we pick up a book, so radical hermeneutical position is that we don't start from a position saying that there is a pure, empirical, unadulterated, independent position that we can adopt, and we need to get into that somehow. And that's our safe ground where we can evaluate what's going on around us. And it pertains to pure reason, and that's the Enlightenment project. But I think the post-Enlightenment project, which is very well informed, is that it's a more contemporary philosophical position, as I say, position. So you start with prejudice, but we need to, and this builds into the idea of the workings of prejudice as we read a text, because it's all based on text, philosophy. We come to a text, a brand new text, whatever it is, it could be a novel, it could be a scholarly work, and we have our expectations already, and we kind of project those into the text. But then if we're open to the text, then it'll speak back to us and transform us in some way. We will interact with the text. It's not as though we're a blank slate and we see something brand new, and all of a sudden it fills this void and gives us all this information and knowledge. there's an interaction. And over time, our prejudice will or won't be transformed. One of the big things within hermeneutics is this constant repetition, and this is the nature of, I guess, art and good scholarship is you're constantly revisiting the thing, and it changes and you change in light of revisiting.
Isn't prejudice not necessarily a helpful word because it kind of suggests there's a position that's not prejudice. And what you're really saying actually is that you have a belief, and that belief might change under certain influences, but we're never really in the position to know whether or not it's correct or not. But we might be in a position to know whether or not it's pragmatic or useful to hold that belief or to give an analysis in that case. Isn't that sort of eternal reoccurrence position that you're advocating?
You said practically useful. I mean, I'm a pragmatist as well, which I think pragmatically. You said pragmatically.
Yeah.
To me, that's the good criterion of truth. Is it useful in this context or whatever, and constantly challenging that position. So that, I mean, that's an accepted philosophical position, which, I mean, Heidegger talks about pragmata, but it's not as though he's necessarily the one who brings that to the fore. It's the American pragmatist tradition, William James and so on, and more lately Richard Coyne and others. And I find that the most useful one. I mean, because I'm not a philosopher, I often feel I don't have to justify the kind of the truth of something in some absolute sense. Mind you, I don't think many philosophers do that in any case. But from a design and architectural point of view, it's about what's kind of useful. So when I did my piece on Derrida, I was trying to justify why Derrida is useful for us and why this idea of challenging and inversion and so on might be useful pragmatically in an architectural context. And I think that is a Derridean position, in fact, to sort of go practically. But to me, that's the quest as to whether it's somehow, whatever the position is, somehow, well, I don't think there is an absolutely stable position that you can appeal to assert that this is the case under all circumstances.
But doesn't that lead to an ethical position? Because if you take your example about how forests think and people holding animist beliefs, you might want to say they're holding those animist beliefs because it's pragmatic, it's the way they live within the forest. You wouldn't want to be called them backwards or lacking in data or information or facts, because that would be a kind of cruelty and violence about your own knowledge.
About them. So, I mean, the pragmatic position is, one of its positions there is to be very appreciative of how useful a belief system is in a particular context. Hopefully, you're bearing in mind there's going to be transformation and change. These things are dynamic. I think you just supported, or did I miss something there?
No, I was just curious how you're dealing with that question in nature when you showed that sort of slide, whether you were just putting that up as a cultural phenomenon or a sort of argument.
Well, I mean, I see it as a challenge to me, for one thing, because here's somebody who I ought to listen to, meaning the academic. And I just read his stuff on Charles Hans Peirce, who's a famous pragmatist of that school, who talks about semiotics and science systems. And what's really interesting, and also the dissolution of the nature-culture divide, which seems to be a pragmatic there in the literature, going back some 100 years. So I was giving this author credence, and I was engaged and interested because of all that, and I can relate to those ideas. But also there's a huge challenge in that the text that I showed you, as far as thinking, that does sound like animism, and all this stuff about enchantment and re-enchantment, which I think Max Weber talks about, re-enchanting the objects. But as an academic, the nice thing is you can sort of draw back from actually saying, well, do I accept it, don't I? Just the very fact that an anthropologist is thinking that way and justifying it through a particular trajectory of argument is a fascinating thing to engage with. So I'm curious and engaged and hopefully open. It's not to say, just so an empty vessel ready to be filled with his ideas about politics, talking to you or talking to each other. What does it mean? Because I mean, the thing that we learn from Derrida, I suppose, is when you reverse something or think of something in an oblique, even perverse way, it's not as though the terms are just the same. So if you say how the forests think, and they do, presumably that redefines what thinking is. You know? So that is a fascinating challenge. And I think. So what does that mean about me and about what I'm engaged in when I think? I mean, lots of people have talked about thinking as being not just something that happens here. And Hegel wrote about thinking, and Heidegger wrote about thinking with a capital T, and thought somehow is bigger than all of us, and it's kind of happening. You tied it up with sort of romantic ideas about eras and ages, and historicism and so on, but it's a really interesting idea that thought is beyond us.
One more from the board who's been waiting for a while, and then two in the room. So this question is this: the availability and sharing of information online facilitates and enables the transfer of knowledge and generation of ideas among previously excluded groups. Yet the net result, excuse the pun, doesn't seem to produce the kind of revolutionary socio-political outcomes you might expect, apart from possibly the apart from possibly the social media simulated Arab Spring. What are your thoughts on the internet and knowledge as power?
Well, I thought there was going to conclude what do you think about the internet and revolution, because revolution is a fascinating narrative, and of course we know about way back in history, but also Karl Marx and so on. You know, the term revolution and the idea of it is very potent. It's a cultural phenomenon, as is knowledge and so on, and power. But here we are in the 90s, in the noughties, whatever, people talking about the umbrella revolution, which didn't happen in Hong Kong, the Arab Spring, and other ways that we've dumped onto digital networks and so on, the idea of revolution and some sort of responsibility for that. So I think in a way the challenge is the idea of revolution. And we know, I mean, now in retrospect, because some of the events that are being touted as revolutionary, the gloss has gone off it, and the power and the force of the rhetoric has diminished, because we know that what happened in Egypt, for example, wasn't so transformative that the country is totally different. As what happens with any revolution in any case, you get counter-revolutions and oscillations, and maybe things settle eventually, or there's a resurgence of the dominance of capital with a bit of democracy thrown in. Anyway, so I'd throw the question back to the questioner in terms of revolution.
Well, it's interesting, though, that there's a kind of long history of thinking about information and about knowledge as somehow inherently revolutionary or powerful. And I think that, the period that I work on, those bits of optimism and the flip side of that coin, which is terror about the control that people wielding that information will exert over you. But it becomes really robust for a time. The 90s is certainly robust.
Well, it's interesting for many reasons, not least, and I said this in technomassive, and it didn't take much to sift it out. People spoke about the railways in the same way in Britain. It's not only isn't it great we can travel from one end of the country to the other, and it's also the spread of industry and so on, but it's uniting the world. And all these metaphysical ideas, a bit like the singularity and other claims that are made in network culture, is that we're going to be united, and it becomes a cause for, or a means of achieving this sort of idealistic aim where everything's somehow one, round, whole, united. It's in a way neo-Platonism as well. It's going to take us up to a new era. So that is said of railways, and there's evidence in the literature clearly. It's said of Gutenberg printing press. I mean, Marshall McLuhan was big on this. I mean, this is the electronic age, as he understood this. It's going to usher in this new era where we're all humankind under our skin, and we're a global village. I haven't done a huge study, but I assume that other technologies assume this global force.
Can you sort of say what you think the real value systems are in all this? If I simplify it, basically, questions you're thinking. You talked about the way we use the internet as potentially reducing our capacity for thought and social thought and adaptation by nature. And we've got apps and environment talk, and we don't enjoy the stress and relaxing aspect of being nature. But you said at another point that what we look for is applications that confirm our own information bias that we need for it's something that that's relaxing to do, isn't it? It's not stressful. It's de-stressing to look at.
So what is?
Well, looking for positions that are evidence that backs up what we already think. It's less stressful to do that. So I just wondered if actually nature you personally enjoy it, therefore that's your value judgment, and nature is good for us because you enjoy it. That's I want to know where your value judgment comes in and all this, and that's actually the screen about here, which unlike security and trust, it's not critical, it's value judgment.
Indeed, and where do our values come from? And are they always something to be made? I'm looking at the sky, it's so bright behind you, the white sky. It's giving expression to values and saying, these are my values, and listing them, as we always have to do when we write grant applications or mission statements or all sorts of things. That's a kind of almost a separate task than actually what you do believe, which is somehow actually innate and comes out in your actions. I mean, you kind of don't know what your priorities are and what your values are until you're exposed to a particular real-life circumstance, do you? So getting someone to disclose their values is just like an exercise in a particular pragmatic context. So there you go.
That's how we can move, or what we can move, what our values are, that shut us off from moving in particular ways.
I think it'd be fair to say, if you're asking in a way a personal question, I don't think I know what my values are in a way, other than in a context of practice and application. And that's one of the exciting things about being exposed to difference and otherness. And we're getting it all the time on the news about all sorts of things to do with what's happening in Syria and having to change our allegiance as a nation or whatever, and immigration, all sorts of things. We're getting exposed to stuff, at least through the media, not necessarily in our neighbourhood. But that's another question. What happens when Syrian neighbours are there? Which making things up on the fly here. But it's often only when you're exposed to a circumstance that question of values sort of emerges.
Yes, this is I've almost forgotten the question. So, the thing I was interested about the trees thinking. And that immediately thought, well, thinking can mean a lot of different things at different times. That's structural thinking as some sort of outcome, or daydreaming, that could be as well. And it also made me think about this business of emotional intelligence, and also can we trust knowledge? Because I also see that knowledge is now so ideologically driven that, it actually just starts to fall out of knowledge if you find that it's just a piece of ideology. And there is this emotional intelligence. That follows me as well, because I'm not quite sure what that means, because there are so many different types of emotion. We're not aware that there's basic love, hate, jealousy, all these things and so on. But what does that actually tell us about individuals? Because the whole thing, if you discover someone's emotional condition, is actually a difficult thing to pinpoint, given that people can change their emotions. So people can be totally in love one day and hate one another the next day. What is it that's driving? So I often find that emotional intelligence actually destroys rational intelligence. There's a dialogue between the two that bothers me.
That's a good sort of enlightenment. But I thought what you said might have led to is anyone here an anthropologist, by the way? Because
historians are supposed to be true.
I see. Well, all praise to anthropologists, because some of the literature is fascinating about the forest. And one of the things I was reading was about emotion. We have emotion words, and we have love, hate, and fear, and anxiety, etc. But they have in different cultural contexts, different words are used, and possibly for the same thing. Well, we don't know what the thing is, but there's a force and a power behind a word. So journalists will report, perhaps I'm making something up, about the angry mob. And that, carries connotations, and that's a way of describing a group of people in a particular context. And that has potency, whereas if you said the crazy mob, that would have a different meaning. Crazy may not be an emotion. Let's see, what else? If you said the happy or delirious mob. But the words are so crucial, the way you describe things, and the way people self-describe. There are certain words that it's acceptable to use. And it turns out that happiness has cultural, political cachet at the moment. It's something you can talk about, whereas maybe 20 years ago it would be stupid, silly to do that. So we're given license to use certain terms and certain emotion terms in certain contexts. But there's also an interesting psychology literature which actually says basically there's only 3 emotional parameters. One, and that's why the word affect is used. And this is going back to the famous positivist guy, escapes me, Descartes' successor, I guess, in Holland, Jewish scholar. Anyway, he invented the term affectus. It's not like this, is it? No, the other one. Anyway, you're going to be looking it up now. He said affectus, so whatever, enlightenment effect. And it's just a spectrum. So negative or positive, and contemporary psychologists have picked up on this. It sounds incredibly reductive. So we just have a sense, a feeling, if you like, and it's either positive or negative. The other dimension is strength. It can either be of a negative strength, which is soporific, and fall asleep with this condition, or it's exciting, and it's the other extreme. So you've got those 2 axes. He actually divides the third one, so it's nicely 3-dimensional, which is attention. So the degree to which we're attending to something. Now that psychologists have had to degree the attention one, but the other 2, they draw charts in certain classes. I show that graph, which is sort of interesting because then you can plot on this affect matrix various other things such as anger in a certain context, or joy, or melancholy, or whatever. Melancholy is very, that's a very interesting case, melancholy. But other emotions, if you like. So all you can say with any kind of degree of certainty, there's an intensity of feeling. And a lot of artists have picked up on this notion. I mean, affect is a great thing to be working with because it's not overburdened. I mean, it has its own values attached to it, but it's not overburdened with the idea of I'm looking at this painting and I feel happy, or it makes me feel sad or joyous or whatever. It has an affect. So it affects me. So I think affect is a really good thing to play around.
It's very important in painting in the 18th century, also music, because what composers strived for was to unify a piece with one single affect.
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't heard that.
Look about affect and the
right.
So it's very big.
Well, that gets us out as artists and designers and creators. It gets us out of the area of the soppy, neo-romantic, populist stuff of this painting on the wall is great. It's of high value because I feel really happy. But if I look at the painting of the Laughing Cavalier, that blue thing, that's made me feel happy. I wouldn't laugh. It seems absurd. But of course, in the movie business, or making popular films, it's something else again, isn't it? Because there is a play on mood, which is another interesting category in the emotional spectrum. But there is usually in the narrative of what a commercial film presents, it is actually taking you on an emotional journey, happiness, joy, sadness. But then, actually, I'm not an expert at being crafting.
So I have another question from the board, and this is specifically about architecture. Arising out of a mixture of idealism and consumerism is a strong digital optimism. This can be represented as a naive faith in the continuous progress, if you will, of human society based on the advancement of technology. Today, contemporary architecture is embracing globalism as well as using the most up-to-date technologies and new materials without too much concern for their realizability and social meaning. Are buildings themselves becoming, or are they intended as a display? What is architecture on a micro scale, as well as perhaps in urban design, or urban design on a macro scale? I think it's, sorry, what is the purpose of these micro scale and macro scale in the near future?
This is a fascinating medium, isn't it?
Yeah, I totally misparsed the grammar.
It's very carefully composed, as you'd expect.
Yeah.
No, so that's fine. I only answered the bits I think I can answer anyway.
Yeah.
But I'm not a naysayer for contemporary architecture. There is a move within architecture which there's a scholar who I know. I'm going to remember now the name of that positive philosopher, and I'm trying to remember this other guy. Perez Gomez, who's a great guy, and he's visited Edinburgh on occasion, and read his books. And he's an architect and of the phenomenological school, and is a fan of Edinburgh and Edinburgh. Unless he's changed his tune in a recent book called something about tuning. It's very, it's ain't it awful. What's happening in contemporary architecture, and a lot of it's driven by computers and computer-aided design. This building was designed from an age where it's done on a computer with library elements and everything else, and also visualized and simulated. And that's just typical of what's happening in this day and age. It's non-people centered, and we need to get away from that. Well, I don't sort of buy that negative aspect of what's happening in the contemporary world. With digital media, you need to somehow put it to one side, or see past it, or leave our iPhones at home when we go for a walk in the countryside. So I think there is this sort of reaction against the digital. But then he mentioned idealism and
a mixture of idealism and consumerism.
And then the other was the myth of progress. It didn't say the myth of progress, but the whole narrative about progress and things getting better. Sure, that comes through in the Schmidt thing about Google and so on. And yeah, we're getting cleverer and we're getting better systems, but we need to put that to one side. We're probably out of time now, aren't we? Spinoza. Thank you, Spinoza. That's a good note to end on.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for a wonderful talk.